Yeah. Hi, Dr. Housley. Thank you for answering my question. I'm fairly new to Motus Nova. Just found out about you guys a couple days ago and decided to uh, find out more. I've been having some good conversations here. And one of the things that really stood out to me in the initial call was hearing some pretty amazing stories about improvements from the Motus Nova systems. Um, and in some ways, it's counterintuitive to me to hear that so much of this is, or that the Motus Hand specifically, really both, I guess, are something as simple as moving your wrist up and down, right? So how my question was, how how do we see such drastic improvements in things like grip strength or arm shoulder movement or writing even, from something so seemingly simple as just moving your wrist up and down?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's honestly a very tough one because it kind of forces us to think about a number of different aspects about not only neuro rehab but also about how biologic systems adapt just in general. And I'm actually going to start from that position, in that sort of more general approach outside of even neurologic injury. So I'll just take neurologic injury and put that to a side for a second. And let's think about what happens to just a general biologic system as we do things to it. And this is important, and it'll be a reason for me bringing this up. And that is most biologic systems work on biologic systems. I mean, basically animals, humans included, our skin, our muscle, our bones, our nervous systems, all of these things, our blood volume, our metabolic systems, all of these different biologic systems have sort of the same sort of foundational elements. And that is they work in a sort of stimulus response fashion. And what that means is as a stimulus is induced upon them, for instance, a muscle, if you have a muscle, there's a standard muscle, and you induce a stimulus, like you stretch it or you load it, you basically, in this case, you do strength training. If you do these perturbations, these stimuli to these various systems, what happens is there are intrinsic properties of these various components that will start to adapt. And the reason is if you provide and you condition on providing adequate stimulus, meaning it's hard enough, those systems will start to adapt and respond. And the response is conditioned on what the stimulus is. So, for instance, if you induce a stretch on a muscle, what would happen is the actual protein structures will start to lengthen and you will accommodate a longer muscle. On the other side of things, if you load the muscle and you load it sufficiently hard, it will actually increase the cross-sectional area. It will increase the specific tension of that muscle with the express purpose of making it more resistant to a similar type of stimulus. These things, these sort of stimulus response processes, again, conditioned on being an adequate stimulus, meaning hard enough to cause a change, are conserved across most systems. And so this is true for the neurologic systems. If you are training something like a precision motor task, it will respond and adapt. So this is sort of the baseline function of all sort of biologic processes. And we're trying to leverage that capacity to help someone recover from a neurologic injury. And so how do we get improvements in grip strength? How do we get improvements in fine motor skills? How do we get improvements in general functions? And the truth is we have to take the deficient components where we have limitations or we have impairments. We have to identify what those impairments are, and we have to deliver a sufficiently hard stimuli to induce those changes, sort of pull out the bag of tricks in biology and really try to induce a positive change. And so the Motus Hand, how this process works is we work on sort of driving the neurologic system to have an appropriate stimulus. And when it comes to precision motor skills and normal sort of neuromotor controls and networks, the way you develop those new networks and you drive a sufficiently hard stimuli is you have to actually do the motions, right? That is the sufficient stimuli for neuromotor networks or for sensory motor networks. And so by nature of helping people walk through this foundational component of arm and wrist movement, we build up the sort of the stimulus, and we continually drive more and more activation of those networks of neurons, and they will configure into a new, more stable pattern that people can then reliably use later down the line. Now, what happens is, how do we get the sort of carry-on effects to more precision motor skills? Well, it's kind of like a foundation, right? You have to build the capacity to do these baseline functions before you can do something as complex as, for instance, like write signature, do arithmetic, these sort of things. And so the Motus Hand provides a bridge from not being able to do things at all, not be able to move your arm or initiate that movement, to the place of then being able to do those foundational elements. And then what happens is, now that they have access to more sort of baseline function of their arms or their legs, in the case of the Motus foot, they can then revert a sort of bad problem that happens after neurologic injury called learned non-use. And this is what happens after neurologic injury. And then sort of after you build up those foundations, people are able to integrate their hand back into daily life. And this is what I was talking to my previous guest about, and that is that concept of translating. It's not just the Motus Hand will give you all of these capabilities. You have to then integrate those new baseline functions into your daily life, and translate that to real sort of performance and real improvements. And so this is why I always encourage people to pick out, as you identified, Jonathan, in our previous conversation, something like an objective task that's super goal oriented, right? Like, I want to learn to write my name again or write a sentence. You take on that task and you pair that with the Motus Hand as a sort of a priming exercise. And so you use the Motus Hand as the foundational element building tool, and then you layer on top of that the complex real world tasks that people care about. And so that's sort of that pairing is where we really get the sort of the additive effects, the real benefit. And so I can go into detail about a whole sort of laundry list of other things that are important here, but in the interest of everyone's time, I want to see if that was at least an adequate answer for you, Jonathan. I'm getting a lot of comments here in the live stream here, but let me know what your thoughts are on that so far.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. So working as a priming effect for a lot of these other things, would you expect that people, in addition to doing functional tasks, would you expect that people normally would supplement Motus Hand or Motus Foot with more targeted exercises as well? Something to improve these things, like in addition to that priming, or do you really feel like functional tasks would cover that, or would be superior to kind of targeting specific whatever?
Ooh, using very loaded questions there, Jonathan. No, it's good. In terms of I'm queuing in on, you probably know what I'm queuing in on, this term superior. And the answer to that question is almost in all cases of neuro-rehab, we have very little data that directly compares, pits two different types of rehab interventions. Those are very, very hard to do, very, very costly. And we don't have a whole lot of evidence out there about that. So I'm not going to be able to speak about a superior approach versus another, especially when we're talking about these complex things. So that's going to be an adequate answer, or sort of maybe a less than optimal answer for you there. But to your original question, that is, should we do targeted exercises in addition to these approaches? And the undisputed answer to this is yes, very much so. And I think some of the best approaches out there are to use these sort of multimodal based approaches, where we're using a variety of different tools to help drive towards a common goal. And so if I'm ever working with patients directly, right, if I actually have patients under my care and I'm a therapist, I will utilize the Motus Hand approaches to get the high level of stimulus that I cannot deliver efficiently, right? Just one-on-one care. That's just not practical for me to spend, 4+ hours with an individual on a daily basis. But what we'll do is we'll use that tool as a prerequisite to then going into those very, very targeted approaches. And I will specifically identify a goal. And I think it's good to identify maybe one, maybe two. I wouldn't go any much more than that, 2 types of goal tasks. And I actually, depending on that individual's function, I will decompose the complex task they want to do. Let me give you an explicit example of this. I actually worked with someone who's really trying to get back to brushing their hair. people think, oh, brushing the hair, really simple, right? Pretty simple task. It's actually incredibly complex, right? You have to be able to, I'm gonna use a highlighter because I don't have a brush with me right now. You have to be able to not only identify this in visual motor space, you have to be able to get the right arm configuration to this. You have to get the right aperture of your hand to get around the actual comb or the brush. Then you have to be able to manipulate that object to the appropriate position of your hair. Do it without vision to be able to manipulate the object in your hair and your interaction, and then do this repeatedly, right? Very, very complex sensory motor task. And so what I would do is I would do a decomposed task, and I would break it down into the serial components, and then we would practice those in sort of a very, very intense program where we would work diligently 20, 30 reps on the individual components of that task. And again, these things are working after, an hour or so on the Motus Hand. And so that sort of follow-up approach where I'm using this to sort of prime the system and then translate it immediately to the functional task of interest appears to be very, very helpful. And this bores out in the literature as well, these sort of combinatorial approaches. So I'd say to answer your question, yes, you certainly want to integrate those targeted approaches as well. And those targeted approaches can be ADLs, but conditioned on how much that person can complete an ADL independently, we may have to do different levels of decomposition of that task to make sure they can actually do it. So I'd say broadly, yes, to answer your question, but depending on how they are functioning, we may need to modify it in different ways to allow them to do it.